In a crisis, a catastrophe, a doomsday scenario, what kind of foxhole do you hunker down in, and who do you want to share it with? Those two questions shape much of the apocalyptic fiction written in the past 2 centuries, and the answers offered by writers often reflect fundamental differences in their views of human nature. Some are deeply pessimistic, others are more hopeful. When confronted with an existential challenge, are we more likely to be guided by our predatory, carnivorous instincts? Or will our communal, supportive, herbivore nature take hold? Will we be hunters at heart, or will we gather and cultivate what remains of society? And there's another question running through many apocalyptic works. Is humanity's inherent curiosity, its ingenuity, a blessing or a bane? Does it lead us to devastating fits of stupid, short-sighted, and self-destructive overconfidence? Or is it the key to our continued survival? Or is it both? Let's explore how various authors have addressed those questions and the philosophical debates about human nature that underlie them. Welcome to the Library Ladder. Apocalyptic fiction comes in a multitude of flavors. There are pulpy adventure stories, brutal, shocking survival tales, pastoral elegies, contemplative character studies, religious morality tales, socially aware satire, and postmodern weirdness. Apocalypses cross genre categories from science fiction to fantasy, mystery, YA, historical fiction, and literary fiction. Its purpose or underlying message might be cautionary, educational, aspirational, or advocacy-based. Or it might simply aim to entertain, provoke, titillate, or appeal to uncomfortable stereotypes and worldviews. The stories they tell can be hyper-realistic in their level of detail, or vague, dreamlike, and allegorical. And they can range from global-scale epics all the way down to intimate personal narratives about individuals coping with isolation and solitude. Thus, there's something for nearly everyone in the broad expanse and long history of apocalyptic fiction. It's so much more than stories of barbaric radioactive wastelands or hordes of flesh-eating undead. Nevertheless, a useful starting point for discussing the philosophical underpinnings of the subgenre is with some of its most brutal and violent examples. In 1651, English political philosopher Thomas Hobbes published his most famous work, Leviathan, in which he characterized human nature as inherently amoral, savage, and motivated primarily by fear and desire. He argued that without a strong and supreme leader, for example, a tyrant king, to control the predatory instincts of the masses, people are doomed to lives that are, as he put it, solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. That pessimistic view of human nature pervades a lot of apocalyptic fiction, particularly the more spectacle-laden varieties that seem to revel in atrocities committed in the name of survival. It's an eat-or-be-eaten world where the law of the jungle prevails when the comforts and conveniences of modern society break down. In those novels, the social fabric that holds us together tends to unravel almost instantly after an apocalyptic event. Roving bands of malicious rogues materialize overnight to threaten and despoil communities. Neighbors turn on one another in a heartbeat, rationalizing it as self-preservation. Violence and the law of the gun quickly become the default methods of resolving disagreements or achieving almost any objective. Some early depictions of humanity's rapid collapse into barbarism worth checking out are Herbert Best's surprisingly gripping 1940 novel, The 25th Hour, and John Christopher's harrowing No Blade of Grass, also titled The Death of Grass, from 1956. Attempts by individuals or groups to assert authoritarian control over the remnants of society through fear and violence are frequent elements of those kinds of stories. Nobel Prize winner Jose Saramago captures that dynamic surprisingly well on a small scale in his 1995 novel Blindness. Many of the novels that fall into this category, though, aren't as literary as the ones I just mentioned. Instead, they tend to be testosterone-laden adventure thrillers, odes to infallible and indestructible heroes who survive orgies of violence and mayhem using cunning, competence, and ruthlessness in order to protect their own families and loved ones. So-called shit-hits-the-fan stories of this type have proliferated in recent years, often following a template established by 1981's Total War, the first book in Jerry Ahern's The Survivalist series. The Survivalist's main character is John Rourke, a hyper-competent military and intelligence service-trained badass who strives to reunite with his family and preserve a degree of social order in the wake of a devastating nuclear first strike on the U.S. by the Soviet Union. He's a lone wolf with a vigilante moral code that protects the weak, but shows no mercy to any human scum in his way. Think Jack Reacher at the end of the world as we know it. Rourke is also a prepper. To the mystification and consternation of his wife, he's spent years stockpiling food and weapons and learning essential survival skills in the event the world goes haywire. His preparedness pays off, though, both for himself and his family. As I said a moment ago, this isn't high art or great literature. It's pure spectacle, adrenaline, and cold-blooded justice, with a helping of MacGyver-like ingenuity and problem-solving, a formula recycled by others in countless prepper porn novels in recent years. Perhaps the most influential of those recent disaster novels, in which an extremely capable man with military training and useful survival skills saves his loved ones from predation in the wake of a cataclysm, is William Forstchen's 2009 novel 1 Second After and its sequels. It imagines an atmospheric electromagnetic pulse weapon, or EMP, disabling nearly every electronic device in the U.S., returning the country to the technological equivalent of the 1940s, but without the tools or practical know-how that were common back then. In true Hobbesian fashion, within hours after the lights go out in a small North Carolina town, even before the cause of the blackout is known, and before news of the EMP attack has been made public, townspeople and stranded travelers start threatening violence. Looting becomes a problem. Vigilante justice rears its ugly head, and elected government leaders and community service providers show weakness in the face of a crisis, inviting a do-it-yourself approach to authoritarian decision-making and survival planning. Again, that's right from the start. It's a fever dream in which the author pessimistically assumes that members of a small, close-knit rural community would quickly default to anarchy and an every-man-for-himself attitude, rather than to a communal response focused on mutual aid and support. Consider me skeptical, and it's my biggest frustration with these types of stories. I truly appreciate and enjoy the preparedness they advocate. There's nothing wrong with making contingency plans for unpleasant possibilities, and in many cases, it's probably wise to do so. I have survival guides of my own, a 3-month supply of canned goods in my pantry, and a wide array of useful tools and skills I've acquired over the years. But I fundamentally disagree with the Hobbesian view that the world will go to hell in a handbasket in an instant. I think our social fabric is more resilient than that. Alas, books like Forstchen's and his many imitators might be doing more harm than good. While exposing readers to useful preparedness lessons and survival techniques, might they also be distorting reader views about civic engagement, neighborly obligations, and the value of simple acts of kindness and generosity, creating a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy that leads them to assume the worst in people, stoking fear of others, and encouraging a shoot first and ask questions later mentality. This type of story is far more common today than it was generations ago, which makes me wonder whether art is imitating life or life is imitating art. Are the fraying social ties and eroding sense of civic responsibility observed in recent years a cause or an effect of this Hobbesian trend in fiction, as well as in other media such as television and film? Another branch of apocalyptic fiction that seems to take inspiration from Hobbes involves religious dystopias that arise from civilization's ashes to impose their own form of tyrannical order and morality in place of the absolute monarch Hobbes advocated. 2 duologies from the 1990s are among the best and most disturbing examples. Octavia Butler's Earthseed series, comprising 1993's Parable of the Sower and 1998's Parable of the Talents, and Esther Friesner's 1991 novels, The Psalms of Herod and The Sword of Mary, are brutal in their depictions of the treatment of the poor, the displaced, the powerless, and women at the hands of shattered societies that claim divine right from a seemingly sadistic God to repress, exploit, and control their members. Those duologies have much in common. The apocalypses in both are driven by environmental and climate factors that lead to the collapse of social order. Butler's Earthseed occurs at the tail end of the apocalypse during the chaotic transition from our modern world to a very different one, while Friesner sets her story further in the future, once memories of the collapse have faded and society has reverted to small-scale agrarian communities. In a sense, Friesner's novels might be considered distant sequels to Butler's, despite being published years earlier. The connection between them is further sharpened by vaguely fantastical elements involving their protagonists' heightened empathic sensitivity that becomes instrumental in their efforts to offer an alternative to the prevailing Hobbesian outlook. I think highly of both duologies, but I'll caution that they aren't for the faint of heart. A few decades after Hobbes, another English philosopher, John Locke, published his famous work, Two Treatises of Government, in 1689. It was a rebuttal of sorts to Hobbes's view of human nature as amoral and violent. Locke took as a starting point the idea that human nature has a fundamental goodness. It can be chaotic and led astray, but he argued that human behavior is largely motivated by a desire to preserve natural human rights, such as personal autonomy and free will. His is a more optimistic view than Hobbes's. Locke acknowledged the potential for tyranny and barbarism to arise in society, but he argued such outcomes weren't inevitable and that they could be defended against with governments designed to promote and protect human rights, such as life, liberty, and property, through the consent of the governed. He imagined a more collaborative social contract that incentivized public participation because the benefits of society couldn't be guaranteed to those who remained apart from it or to those who allowed others to dominate it. In the context of apocalyptic fiction, this sometimes translates into a join or die attitude towards survival. Remnants of humanity banding together to help one another, to preserve civilization, and to defend against authoritarianism and anarchy as they confront the hardships and dangers of a reshaped world. This tension between the brutality of Hobbes and the enlightened approach of Locke is present in many apocalyptic works. Philip Wiley's early 1930s duology, When Worlds Collide and After Worlds Collide, blends elements from Hobbes and Locke, contrasting the mob violence that afflicts Earth's doomed masses with the collaborative and entrepreneurial spirit of a small group of individuals who construct a lifeboat to escape and rebuild on a new planet. The rise of authoritarianism in Europe in the 1930s led to several classic apocalyptic tales containing warnings about the dangers of ignoring Locke's social contract enshrining the human rights of the governed. Two that straddle the line between satire and serious are Carol Capek's 1936 novel War with the Newts and R.C. Sheriff's 1939 novel The Hopkins Manuscript, also titled Cataclysm. War with the Newts skewers humanity's history of colonialism, slavery, and racism by putting the shoe on the other foot when a subjugated alien race learns from its human taskmasters how to reciprocate. The Hopkins Manuscript is a slightly old-fashioned mashup of H.G. Wells' catastrophe fiction and P.G. Wodehouse social comedy that follows a fussy, self-absorbed retired schoolmaster living in the English countryside in the years before and after a cataclysm caused by the moon's sudden deviation from its orbit and collision with the Earth. The schoolmaster frets about his prize-winning chickens more than he worries about the end of the world, which the author intended as an allegorical criticism of Britain's complacency and self-absorption in the face of rising European fascism and growing colonial restlessness within the British Empire. It was a warning for Britain to abandon the comforts of routine and to pay closer attention to the needs and threats of others, both at home and abroad, in a time of growing peril. It's a surprisingly fun, cozy read. And cozy is a word often associated with John Wyndham's influential novels, although I don't think the cozy label truly fits. Several of his books have apocalyptic settings in which characters strive for simple personal autonomy and collaborate with others to understand the plight of the wider world and to find refuge. They reflect John Locke's belief in enlightened, rational self-interest, that individual free will is best protected in partnership with others, which Wyndham often presented in direct competition with the base fears and lusts of a Hobbesian environment in which the strong and ruthless prevail. Wyndham is widely considered one of the greatest British science fiction authors of all time, and 1951's The Day of the Triffids, 1953's The Kraken Wakes, and 1955's The Chrysalids, also titled Rebirth in the US, are some of his best-regarded works. The Day of the Triffids might have inspired Jose Saramago's novel Blindness, with its sudden blinding of a population, leaving them at risk of predation by human and other biological threats, including a lethal virus and large genetically engineered carnivorous plants that are both sentient and mobile. Although the title and book cover promise thrilling peril from rampaging plant monsters, the narrative is more of a meditation on rationality in the face of catastrophe, with characters ruminating on different socio-political approaches to rescue civilization from oblivion. The Kraken Wakes follows a husband and wife team of journalists as they document an alien invasion of Earth, the global response to defend against it, and a resulting environmental apocalypse triggered by rising sea levels. And The Chrysalids, or Rebirth, is the best of the bunch, set decades after a nuclear war has left much of the world a radioactive wasteland, with remnants of humanity surviving in tiny, rustic communities on isolated patches of relatively untainted land. Primal fear of radiation-induced mutations in those villages fuels a tyrannical form of governance in which genetic purity is policed and maintained with religious fervor and absolute lethality. The novel explores what happens when a handful of adolescents with hidden mutations band together to seek freedom and perhaps to rebuild a new and improved human race. The evolution and improvement of humanity is a central theme of 18th century Swiss philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau's theory of governance. He believed people are inherently peaceful, self-sufficient, and sympathetic toward others, and that what corrupts our nature is our dependence on societal structures that foster competition and undermine efforts to pursue the common good. Where Locke welcomed the civilizing influences of collaborative and competitive economic, social, and political systems, believing they promote stability and prosperity, Rousseau was more skeptical, claiming civilization's advancement is inherently cyclical, fueled by an oscillating boom and bust pattern in which societies inevitably collapse under the weight and complexity of their progress, sometimes to reemerge from the ashes to start again, and sometimes to fail altogether. Somewhat morbidly, he viewed every disaster as an opportunity for civilization to rid itself of corrupting influences and to reinvent itself in a way that better serves the common good. He hoped the end result of that repeated cycle of failure and incremental improvement would be a utopia in which governance decisions that reflect the public will are made by society's participants in a form of direct democracy. Contained in Rousseau's ideas are hints of social Darwinism and the Buddhist quest for nirvana through reincarnation, as well as a strong preference for small city-states over larger nation-states, which he felt were difficult to sustain. Some of those ideas can be found in many works of apocalyptic fiction. H.G. Wells, in his 1933 novel The Shape of Things to Come, adopted Rousseau's cyclical framing as he imagined a series of world wars, plagues, and global regime changes over the course of the 20th century that wipe out most of humanity and lead to a utopian global village in which power rests in the hands of a highly educated middle class of society. Fritz Leiber's Gathered Darkness from 1943 takes Rousseau's idea of cyclical creative destruction and explores how the civilizing influences of religion, technology, and mass communication might combine to create successive dystopias in a post-apocalyptic world. It prophetically considers what might happen when a group of powerful tech bros use religion-tinged propaganda to convince the masses that technology is magic beyond their understanding and to deify themselves as saviors, in order to assert authoritarian control of society. Consistent with Rousseau's outlook, a dissident group of tech bros rebels against the ruling group, sparking a revolution ostensibly aimed at liberating the masses. But is their proposed cure any better than the disease it seeks to eradicate when people will remain in thrall to new technologies run by a new set of overlords? The merging of religion and science and the corrosive effect technological advancement can have on institutions devoted to preserving a society's knowledge and values are central ideas in Walter M. Miller's classic 1959 novel, A Canticle for Leibowitz. In 3 parts, it tells a 1,000-year story of a world rebuilding itself after a devastating nuclear holocaust returned civilization to the equivalent of the Dark Ages. The scientific knowledge of the past is preserved only through the efforts of an isolated Catholic monastery that collects pre-Holocaust records that it doesn't even understand. Over centuries, the monks are able to decipher many of the ancient records, launching a new age of enlightenment. However, in their quest for knowledge, will the monks learn from the lessons of the past, or are they doomed to repeat history's failures? Miller's answer to that question has echoes of Rousseau. Neil Stephenson's Anathem, or Anathem, bears a striking thematic resemblance to A Canticle for Leibowitz, but with some significant twists added. In it, the history of the world over thousands of years has been marked by repeated cycles of technological advancement, leading to apocalyptic self-destruction. Specialized orders of monks have arisen to preserve knowledge and to guide the pursuit of it in the hope of mitigating future collapses. Unlike Walter Miller, who focused his story on a single boom-bust cycle, Stevenson brilliantly considers the possibility of an infinite number of cycles and what the end result of that might be. In a Monte Carlo simulation of unlimited possible outcomes is a utopia in humanity's cards. The Rousseau-like idea that technological progress might be humanity's bane rather than its savior is found in a lot of science fiction. The 1950s produced classics such as Lee Brackett's The Long Tomorrow, Pat Frank's Alas Babylon, and Neville Shute's On the Beach. Those novels inspired many others, including John Brunner's dark satire The Sheep Look Up, Kim Stanley Robinson's The Wild Shore, the first book in his Three Californias triptych, Greg Bear's Blood Music, Ursula Le Guin's Always Coming Home, and James Howard Kunstler's World Made by Hand series. A common theme in many of them is the sustainability of small, mostly self-sufficient communities that aren't dependent on interconnected networks of trade and infrastructure to meet their basic needs. Some project utopian outlooks, while others are pretty bleak. Self-sufficiency is a central part of Jean-Paul Sartre's existential philosophy that gives people the freedom to choose their own paths, independent of society's expectations. Where John Locke believed in the necessity of a collaborative society based on enlightened self-interest, and Rousseau advocated for broadly shared agreement about society's common good, Sartre had a take-it-or-leave-it attitude toward civilization. What mattered to him is the supremacy of the individual. A person could choose to join a community out of a desire to protect the collective freedoms of others, or they could just as easily and meaningfully walk away from society to pursue their own interests. Either option is a defensible exercise of individual autonomy and purpose in an existential world in which the meaning of life is defined by each of us on our own terms, rather than in relation to other people. Echoes of Sartre show up in a variety of post-apocalyptic stories that often feature solitary, melancholic protagonists attempting to make sense of their reshaped environment and their place and purpose in it. George Stewart's 1949 masterpiece, Earth Abides, tells a decade-spanning tale of a survivor of a global pandemic that wipes out most of humanity. He finds purpose in preserving knowledge and skills that he hopes to pass on to future generations. He makes a choice to try to rebuild a civilized society, even when that goal isn't fully shared by other survivors he gathers around him. Although the novel nods at Rousseau's cycles of destruction, it fits uncomfortably among his other philosophical ideas. Smaller communities aren't necessarily better or more sustainable if they're incapable of maintaining a critical mass of knowledge. Thematically and tonally, it has a lot in common with Jack London's very readable 1912 novel, The Scarlet Plague. Brian Aldiss's contemplative 1964 novel, Greybeard, is another worthwhile example. Ill-advised nuclear weapons testing has rendered humanity sterile, causing widespread disillusionment and questioning of humanity's purpose as the population ages over the course of decades without new generations of offspring. In England, social order breaks down, devolving into somewhat primitive, quasi-feudal conditions, while an elderly husband and wife dodge indentured servitude, skirmishing warlords, and crafty con artists in a search for meaning in their lives. It's a poignant story that dares to suggest that maybe humanity isn't so special after all, and that perhaps clever animals such as stoats and ferrets are fated to inherit the earth as a fallback in nature's evolutionary tree. Other works with existential elements include Marlene Haushofer's allegorical 1963 character study, The Wall, Robert O'Brien's unnerving 1974 YA novel, Z for Zachariah, Jacqueline Hartman's haunting I Who Have Never Known Men from 1995, Peter Heller's The Dog Stars from 2012, and 2 novels from just last year. Carrie Groner's The Way, which puts a literary sheen on the basic plot premise of Roger Zelazny's 1968 novella Damnation Alley, which helped inspire the Mad Max films. And Leif Inger's I Cheerfully Refuse, a meditation on a husband's grief and his surreal efforts to reconnect with his dead wife that draws inspiration from the tale of Orpheus in Greek mythology. Consistent with Sartre's focus on the individual, all of those works borrow their narrative approaches from character-centric literary fiction, rather than from genre fiction traditions that prioritize plot and world-building. AIs even get in on the existential angst in Walter Tevis's 1980 novel Mockingbird, and in Robert Cargill's Sea of Rust from 2017. Philosophical hybrids also abound. Kate Wilhelm's thought-provoking Hugo and Locus Award-winning 1976 novel Where Late the Sweetbirds Sang borrows Rousseau's cyclicality and emphasis on defining the common good in communities and blends them with Sartre's conclusion that sometimes what's best is to chart one's own path away from society or its remnants. David Mitchell's magnificently ambitious 2004 novel Cloud Atlas combines ideas from Hobbes and Rousseau in a repeating meta-temporal cycle of human predation and evolution over hundreds of years and different stages of human civilization. Tom Rob Smith's Cold People from 2023 starts off as a simple alien invasion novel, but quickly pivots to wrestle with larger issues from Locke and Rousseau, such as the nature of human rights when parts of society are no longer completely human, and who gets to decide which rights get priority and what constitutes the common good for a community and for humanity. It's a fascinating book that, with its ambiguous ending, left me hoping for a sequel. And David Brin's 1985 novel, The Postman, somewhat heavy-handedly incorporates principles from all 4 philosophical schools of thought, with 3 groups of survivors in a post-apocalyptic United States respectively taking inspiration from Hobbes, Locke, and Rousseau, while a solitary Sartre-like main character encounters each group in the guise of a U.S. postal worker delivering mail. In juxtaposing the different philosophies across competing remnants of society, Brin clearly rejected a Hobbesian eat-or-be-eaten future, and he cast a seemingly skeptical eye on where Locke's heavy focus on self-interest and property rights might lead. He seems to have viewed more favorably Rousseau's promotion of shared values and the titular postman's existential decision to define his life on his own terms by striving to preserve and protect the memory and founding ideals of the former United States. My original plan for this video was to combine coverage of the philosophical underpinnings of doomsday fiction with an exploration of specific subcategories, including literary, feminist, and weird tales of the apocalypse. However, as this philosophical section grew in length, I realized I needed to split the video into 2 separate ones. I intend to have the next part ready soon, although my travel schedule over the next few weeks could complicate things. Thanks for watching.